Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate how to create this effect using Blender 2.8 and the Eevee render engine. So you can see we've got something that sort of floats around a bit like a living creature. It has sort of tendrils. I've got some funny effects going on with the materials, and you may just be able to make out there's a little bit of volumetric or smoke effects around it as well as some glowing effects and illumination effects. So to begin with, let's just set Blender to the Eevee render engine. This could be done just as easily in Cycles Render, but you'll probably find it will take quite a bit longer to render the animation if it's an animation you're going to create. So here we are in Blender 2.8. Come up to this sort of TV symbol, come up to here and select Eevee. There's a number of other settings we want to switch on at some point in here, but for the moment we'll just make a start. I'll just put my 3D cursor there, and I'm going to add a plane. I'm going to rotate it on the X90 just to make it easy to see. I'm going to go into orthographic view by pressing 5 on the numpad, and then just press dot on the numpad just to focus in on this plane. I'm going to go into edit mode by pressing tab, and then right click and select subdivide. And we'll say 51. And if I press Z now and go into wireframe view, you can see we've got a row and a column of vertices aligned with the primary axes. And it just makes it easier for what we're doing next. So I pressed A twice just to deselect, press K for the knife tool, and I'm just going to come perhaps one set of vertices away from the center. At the top there, there's the middle, so that's a straight line, but I'm going to come perhaps diagonally 3 sets of vertices away from the center, and then over to the side here. Exactly what you do is up to you. I do the same thing again. And then I press space, and that's now added a set of vertices cutting through all of those existing ones. So I'm now going to box select most of those, and then use C just to select the rest of them. So I'm selecting the vertices I'm not going to need. And we'll zoom in and just select, holding shift down now just to select the remaining ones. Exactly what I'm doing will become clear in a moment. And then press X or delete and say vertices. Where we've got a funny one like that, just select it and make sure it moves around on its own, which it does. And now I'm going to box select. So there's the center. I'm just coming back from the center like that and delete all of those, and box select again and delete those. So if we go into solid view now, we've just got this very basic shape. So next, with our object selected, we need to come down to this little spanner tool, the modifiers tool, add a modifier and make it a mirror modifier. That sort of added a bit to there. X is selected by default, but we want to select Y as well. And if I press 5, we'll go into orthographic view. You probably want to turn on clipping, which helps to join surfaces together. I go into edit mode and I select a vertex like that, GZ. You can see there's a little hole appears, but if you don't want that, we put clipping in. I can no longer lift that away. I can move it left and right, but I can't lift it away. So it just makes sure that things are joined up. And if you do already have a rip, you can just move the vertex down and it will just seal it up. And this controls the distance at which that happens. So that's fine. That's created our basic shape. And before we go any further, I'm going to select all the vertices. I'm looking straight on in orthographic mode, press U, and just say unwrap. It's a very simple shape. So that's the mirror modifier. The next thing we want to do is make this a little bit more interesting. Before we do that, edit mode, and we'll go to vertex properties, and we'll go to weight paint. Create a new vertex group, and with the brush selected, I'm just going to paste a little bit in the middle there, just to partially select a few vertices. And that's given the default name of group. Back to object mode, and then we'll come to physics properties, and I'll click cloth. That's given it a cloth simulation, and I'll click play, and you can see it just drops through the frame straight away. So if we come down to shape, we can select that group as the pinning group, and now when I click play, it hangs from there. And if I right click on there, I can say shade smooth, and it's starting to look a bit like something made of cloth, except it's passing through itself. So we can come on down to collisions, and we can say self collisions. If we press play at this point, it's not uncommon, especially with very simple shapes, to get errors. And we're getting an error here. It's just going off into outer space or something like that. If you find it's a bit unstable, there's a few things that you can do. So at the moment, this is just going off into infinity. I think there's a few bugs in the cloth simulator at the moment, so this may be to do with that. The first thing to do, try rotate X 90, just so that it's flat, and also try setting the distance for self collisions to 0.001. That's a bit too close, really. So we'll go for 0.005. You can see that's not quite working. Something to do with the mirror modifier, possibly 0.0025. So I've gone for 0.0015 there. You'll need to play around with this. Again, a lot of these things vary depending on the actual size of the model you're creating. So that may be part of the problem. And you can see that's working a little better with a larger model. Even there, 0.02. So the exact distance you'll need for self collisions will be affected by the size of your model. Just lift that up a bit. So we've got our basic model. I'm going to, at this point, Control 2 to apply a subdivision surface, just to round those off, which shouldn't make any difference at all. And as is the case with a lot of simulators, there's a little bit of messing around often required just to tweak them, just to get them stable enough to use. So that's working, but there's a few tweaks we want to make to it. So the first thing I changed was the speed multiplier. Up at the top here, you can see the default is 1, so that's simulating how cloth of this particular type might behave in real time. So we can try reducing the speed multiplier. And that effectively means it takes longer for the simulation to work effectively. So it works at a slower speed, so these things float around a bit more. You can see as I pull this around, the simulation's trying to keep up and follow where I'm pulling those central pinning vertices, which gives you a hint to how this is all going to work. We can do things like increasing the air viscosity, so that makes the air thicker, which will actually make these things settle more slowly, but also make them pulled back more as this goes forward. Because one of the things I found was that those tendrils tended to bounce forward, which obviously we don't necessarily want if we want to simulate it being in a kind of fluid. You can play with any of these settings, obviously. I didn't change too many of them. I did increase tension up to 25. And I put quality steps up to 10. Now obviously that's going to make the simulation calculations go more slowly, although ultimately it doesn't really make much difference to the animation itself. But it just means that it's a higher quality simulation. And now we can go back to the modifiers and we can add a solidify modifier. We'll say even thickness, and then we can just play around with the thickness just to give this thing a bit of shape. We can go above or below the subdivision modifier. Make sure the subdivision and solidify modifiers are below the cloth modifier. Otherwise your simulation will go very slowly indeed, because it will be trying to simulate everything on the new geometry being created by these modifiers. I think I'll keep the solidify modifier at the bottom. But again, that shouldn't really affect the cloth simulation itself. So that's created our basic object. Obviously we would create more than one of these, but I'll just do the one for now. And next I'm going to add a light, which is a point light. And I'll just lift that up to about there. And we'll go to the light properties and we'll make this one a bright yellowish light. I had mine at about 50 watts and a radius somewhere comparable with the center of the creature. I then selected the creature, Control P and say Object Keep Transform. And now when I move the creature around, the light will move around with it. So let's put a little shading on the creature. I want to do it now before we animate it, just to make it a little easier. So first of all, we'll go to the shading options up here, and that gives us a new window, which just makes it a little easier to see what we're doing. We'll come down to materials and we'll say new. And we'll call this creature 1. And I decided not to use the principled shader for this one. So essentially, I just made an emissive material. I added a shader which was an emission shader and connected that to the surface. Before we go any further, I think what I will also do is go to the world settings And we'll just say set that to black just to make that easier. And then we'll go to rendered up here. So back to our material, I'm going to add color mix node, connect that to the color input on the emission shader. We'll select one side to a nice bright yellow and the other side we'll set that to quite a contrasting purpley color. I'm going to add a converter, which is a color ramp. Connect that into the factor. We'll set that to ease and I'll bring the points in a little bit. Obviously you can play around with these to get an effect you like. And initially I'm just going to add in, just move this window up a little bit. I'm going to add in a texture, which is a Voronoi texture. So I'll take the factor output of that into the color ramp, and you can see we've got some splotches appeared up there. I'll play around with this scale till it's somewhere around what I want. And at the moment, if I move my object around, you can see that's quite stable. But I'm now going to add an input, which is a texture coordinate input. So I'm now going to add another color mix node and drop that there. I've got my Voronoi texture going into one side. I'm going to add another color ramp. Take the output of that into the other side of that color mix node. Bring the inputs somewhere into the middle and we'll set this one to B-spline. I'm now going to add another texture, which is a noise texture. Take the factor out of that into the color ramp and I'm going to use UV coordinates into the vector. And we can play around with the scale a little bit just to see what that does for us. And all it's doing really is mixing between these two. So we change this to multiply, and now you can see we've got more of a pattern that replicates itself, very much like a real creature would. And we can play around with this to get something that we like, and play with the scale on here as well. And then adjust the factor. So that's all Voronoi and that's all noise, and this can be somewhere in between, just giving us a sort of creature skin, as it were. Next, I'm going to add a texture which is a gradient texture. I'm just going to plug the factor of that straight into here for a moment, and you can see exactly what that gradient texture is doing at the moment. I'm going to take a copy of that color ramp and drop that in there. I'm going to set the gradient texture to spherical. I'm going to set this to B-spline, and we can just get somewhere where we can see there's a difference in the inside there. And if we want to, we can flip the color ramp. So we've got yellow in the middle. So I'll put my noise back into there now, bring this down here, and I'm going to take a copy of that multiply node, put that here, and take the color from ultimately this gradient texture into that multiply node. I'm going to take the output from the Voronoi texture, put that into the other input. I'm going to set the factor up at 1, and then I'm going to add a converter, which is a math node, set to multiply, take the color out from that multiply node and put that into this multiply node. So this is just a color multiplier. This is a mathematical multiplier. I had this up at about 5. And then this fed into the strength of the emission shader. At this point, I'm just going to flip that color ramp again. And really that's just so that it's bright in the center and fades out, but with a bit of noise effect towards the outer extremities. Then we can play around with this just to extend our feelers a little bit. Bearing in mind that's against a black background, so it's almost completely invisible. You could make it go transparent, of course. So there's our basic textured object. Go back to animation. We'll just let it flop down a little bit. And then we'll have a look at what that looks like rendered. So you can see we've got this weird creature here now. They're entirely emissive creatures, and therefore there's no shading or anything needed. And that's part of what speeds up the animation. At this point, if I wanted to, I could turn on bloom, and you can see we get this effect around it. So I'll go back to the standard layout now, but I'll call up a new window, and we'll make that the graph editor. With my object selected, and at the beginning of the timeline, I'm just going to press I and select location. I've done this before in a few other tutorials, so I've just called up the X, Y, and Z location there in the graph editor. And we've got a little point there, which is the keyframe for the location for X, Y, and Z. I'm going to press N, that brings up a window on the side here, and select modifiers. So I want this object to move around semi-randomly without having to animate lots of keyframes. So having recorded that position, Under modifiers, I'm going to click here to add a modifier, and I'll add a built-in function, which by default is sine, and that's the one we want. I'm just going to turn off the visibility of the cloth modifier for a moment. So if we come to the modifiers, it's going to turn off the visibility in the viewport, and you can see at the moment I must have had X selected. It's just moving backwards and forwards like that in X. So I'm going to increase the amplitude, so set that to 2.5. In fact, I'm going to go up to 15. So it's shooting backwards and forwards. But I'm going to change the phase multiplier to 0.025. Now you can see it's moving quite slowly. Generally put a random phase offset on there, it doesn't matter too much. And if you want to move it from its center point, you can use an offset like that. So that's fine. And now I'm going to add another modifier, which is also a built-in function, and it's sine. Set this one to something like 12. The other one has a phase multiplier of 0.025. So I'll set this one to 0.05. But I'll click additive. So it's now adding to the previous one. Just click that on both of them, so it doesn't really matter which one's up there. But the important thing is to have it on the second one. You can now see, although it's not random, it's not as simple a function. And then we need to do the same with the other axes. And you can do more than just 2 as well. So we can add 3, for example. Make sure all bar the first one at least are clicked to additive. Let's go for 20. 15 and 10 for the amplitudes. Now they're just all adding together at the moment because they're exactly the same. I'll put a random phase offset on all of them, so they're all starting somewhere different in their curve, which starts to make it more interesting. But then of course change the phase multiplier. So perhaps 0.01, 0.015, 0.03. That's still only 2 axes, but you can now see if I look from above, both X and Y are varying. You can just about see X ghosted behind it there. If I select that as well, you can see how they're relating to each other. And we can put some phase offset on, which will change things a bit as well. And then finally, we need to do the same with the Z-axis. So you can see we've got an object moving around in a pseudo-random way now. There's the X, Y, and Z overlaid, and you can see although they're cyclic, they phase relative to each other because they're all different frequencies. And now we can see what that looks like with the cloth simulator. So we've got a few errors appearing in there, and they can be addressed. But you can see this is basically swinging this object around now. So these glitches seem to be coming from the Solidify modifier, so I'll just turn that off for now. It can be a bit difficult for things like the Solidify modifier to work on such a dynamic mesh, but we've got our basic object there. And we can play around with some of the settings. So we can try a smaller shear value, a smaller bending value, a larger tension value. So I found you can reduce the air viscosity here if you want the tendrils to fly out a little bit more. You can even go to a really low value. You can see they're flapping around a little bit there, which is quite fun. And of course, exactly what they do will depend on the motion that you've instilled with these modifiers up here. And you can play with the speed multiplier here. And it may seem to get away from its light source occasionally, and that's not too much of a problem. And you can even add forces to add turbulence to the effect and everything else. So the next step is just to add a mesh cube. And this is just going to be our little world within which everything takes place. And I'm going to click smoke with the cube selected and say domain. We'll go for 64 subdivisions at the moment. We'll click dissolve. That means the smoke dissolves shortly after it's created. Other than that, it's the defaults there. We'll say adaptive domain, which just helps to speed things up. But we will also say high resolution. Now we need something to emit the smoke, so I will select my object there, come to physics properties, and we'll say smoke there, and we'll call this a flow object. So this is where smoke flows in or out, or smoke flows in this case. I'm going to say flow source is mesh, so that's the mesh itself. I want it to be basically from the surface. So I actually set that to 0.1, you have to type that in to get that to accept it. From the surface and full volumes. If you have got a volume to your object rather than just a flat plane, it will use that volume. I left absolute density selected. Temperature difference I left at 1. Smoke color doesn't matter too much, but I'll just set that to white. We're going to set our own smoke anyway in a moment. Sampling subframes I put at 3, so this is because the movement's quite fast, so if it doesn't sample where it is frequently enough, you'll get little puffs of smoke rather than a continuous stream. And we use initial velocity, which effectively conveys some velocity to the smoke from the object. So let's just click play on that, and you can see our object is creating a little bit of smoke around itself. That's not too bad actually. It won't render at all at the moment because we haven't given the smoke any properties. But of course that little light that we've got parented should be illuminating that smoke. If I go to rendered view, we can't see anything at the moment, and that's because that smoke has no material. So in the shader editor, with the smoke selected, I'll say new. I could use the principled smoke emitter, but I won't. I'm going to click add shader, emission shader. Then I'm going to add an input, which is an attribute. And in there, all lowercase, type the word density. Take the factor out of there and put that into the strength of this emission shader. And then take the output of the emission shader and put it into volume. So looking through the camera, we can see we are getting some very rough volumetrics now. EV volumetrics doesn't have the level of quality that a Cycles volumetrics render does, but nevertheless we can improve this. So we're only at 64 samples at the moment for our smoke, but we can do a few things with the material first. So first of all, I'm going to add a converter, which is a color ramp, drop that in there. I'll set that to ease, and we'll just lift the bottom end up a little bit, just to add a bit of contrast, and then bring the top down slightly. Depends how thick you want the smoke to be, really. Now, just to increase the strength of it, I'm just going to add another converter, which is a math node, drop that in there. Set that to multiply, and we'll set that to a slightly smaller value or a larger value, depending on whether you want it brighter or dimmer smoke. But right now it's just emissive smoke. We want to do a little bit more than that. It's not going to show the lamp that's in there at all. So I'm now going to add another shader, which is a volume scatter node. Take the output there and put that into density. And let's just look at that one for the moment. So the only lamp in there at the moment is obviously not casting anything onto there right now. So I'm now going to add another shader, which is an add shader. Drop that into there and drop the emission shader on there as well. And we'll turn the color now full up to white. And we can play around with how strong our smoke is. So at this point, let's go back to the smoke properties and set this to 128. And let's get this to render a few frames. So we do get some strange artifacts with EV volumetrics, and we can improve those a little bit. I'm going to set the temperature difference to 0, which will mean the smoke won't rise. Not so easily anyway. And then I'm going to come over to here and we'll change the tile size to 4. I did tend to get some crashes when I set it to 2, so this is basically a higher resolution. The way that EV seems to render volumetrics is in slices that are then overlaid on top of each other. So at a glance, they look reasonably convincing, but it's not rendering the whole volume. And that's how it does it so quickly. And let's just put 1000 for the end distance on the volumetric effect. We'll turn this distribution effect down. So if we see how that's doing, And you can see we've got a lot more smoke appearing. It is a little splotchy. Part of that is the resolution. Part of that is we can probably do more time samples, but it's giving you a general idea. If I turn the overlay off there, it's giving you a general idea of what we can get. And we should have that into strength for the emission rather than color. And then we'll just turn the color of the emission down a little bit so it's not quite so bright. And you can probably just about see we're starting to get a little color from the lamp there. Not very much, I must admit. But that's down to where the lamp is relative to the object. And obviously as that passes through the trails of other creatures, that will show up as well. So I used an actual resolution for my smoke of 256. So I'll just give that a quick go and we'll see what that looks like. I'll turn off the overlay, go back to the beginning, look through the camera for the time being, and we'll set the domain to 256 and we'll just bake that. So I'll stop the recording while I do that. So we can see what that's doing now. We've got a good bit of smoke coming around. And I just animated the camera moving around and following it and so on. And you can see how the smoke's fading away over time. I had my smoke quite a bit more subtle than this, obviously. So we can turn this multiplier down here. Just to give a more subtle effect. We could probably do with a few more subframes, which is why we're getting these sort of pulses. Probably needs quite a few more actually, probably more like 6. And that would give us a smoother effect to the smoke. But that gives you the general idea of how to create it. You can see it creates some interesting effects. We're getting a little bit of coloration from the lamp that I've got on there. So we don't need to rebake it to change the look of the smoke. We can do it here. See, that's much more dense. And then this is much less dense, much less of it. Let's go to B-spline. That might be a bit too much. And we can change values here as well, of course. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I now have a Patreon page as well. And I'll provide links to all of those in the description below. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.